Hello, friends. I just wanted to have a little discussion about some thoughts I've had recently. I came up with this question after listening to a bunch of controversy surrounding the World Cup, and it got me thinking about soul. What is soul as a quality and as a metaphor, not exactly as a thing? Certainly not as an immortal metaphysical entity that lives inside of us. But I started thinking about soul as a quality. And in my point of view, soul is sort of a moral ethical synthesis that some people have, but not all. And that synthesis is essentially the result of a sort of a raised or heightened level of consciousness that results from observing society and civilization and self in a very intimate and personal way, wherein you witness damage, degradation, wherein you experience trauma that is caused by various factors, some of which are direct and deeply personal, and some of which are abstract and nebulous. But the bottom line is that you are able, in your mind and in your quote-unquote soul, able to connect the dots. And when you see the evidence of damage or harm, you're able to say, I understand what is the root cause of that damage and harm to myself, to society. You're able to identify those factors, whatever they are, and it paints a pretty vivid picture in your mind about what a person or corporation or entity might do that could cause significant harm to people and society versus what a person or corporation or whatever could not do to avoid causing harm and damage. So, that in my mind is kind of what soul is as a metaphor. And anyone who has experienced trauma or abuse has the capacity, and let's be honest, that's all of us, right? Has the capacity to cultivate soul inside themselves. And that's kind of what, to me, sets them apart from all the people in the world who haven't really cultivated soul or don't really have it in a quantity that really registers on an interpersonal or broader social level. In a sense, I guess you could say that soul is somewhat like a scar or scar tissue or calluses that build up in response to pain and suffering and physical damage. The more of that you endure, theoretically, the more soul you might have. And ultimately, what is kind of the defining characteristic of soul, to me, is a greater level of perception, of feeling, and the ability to comprehend a more expansive spectrum of human emotion. And if everything is wired typically within your brain, when you have those greater perceptions, it results in higher levels of compassion and empathy for your fellow human beings. And in a way, it triggers something of an immune response in people. So when they witness damage or harm to others, whether it's an immediate, direct sort of thing or the more abstract type that I was talking about earlier, they respond to that in a defensive way, trying to protect and shield others from harm if they're capable. Because more than anyone, they understand the consequences of that trauma and that harm and how badly it can mess you up. And they don't want that to happen to anyone, and they really don't want it to happen to themselves either. Now, on the other side of the coin, we have, the soulless. And now I don't want this to seem judgmental in any way, because I feel like unless there's something wrong in the brain that causes sociopathy or psychopathy, people aren't capable of experiencing heightened levels of consciousness, empathy, and compassion unless they've been exposed to the horrors of trauma, abuse, and all those things in a way that touches them deeply. And in that sense, they are sheltered and privileged and innocent, and they simply haven't developed the capacity to experience and synthesize the scope of those emotions. That being said, I think that there is a difference between being soulless by nature versus having the makings of a soul, but leaving those components disassembled and turning a blind eye to the reality that you know, but on some level refuse to acknowledge. And this level of thinking and these contradictive paradoxes in the mind, I think, were very clearly on display when the World Cup was happening, because on one hand you had millions of people who were celebrating, enjoying, and reveling in the spectacle and the sport, and on the other hand you had who knows how many people recovering and coping with the trauma of being forcibly removed from their lands and homes, abused and enslaved in order to create that spectacle and to make it possible. Now, here's where things get a little bit ideological. I think that for those with souls, as I have defined them previously in the video, it's impossible to separate the spectacle from the abuse, and therefore it's impossible to enjoy the spectacle. It has become tainted it has become polluted and defiled. It's no longer a celebration. It's actually the opposite. You could say it's a celebration of abuse and mistreatment and harm. But for many people, the synthesis never occurs or is unformed, or it reaches a point where there's a threshold that won't be crossed over, where a person can be cognizant of the things that have had to happen in order for something that they enjoy or love to be presented to them on a silver platter. But these people will not acknowledge those things. In their mind, there will be a separation between, the bad process that created the thing that they want to enjoy and the thing that they plan on enjoying. And I find this really fascinating. And personally, I think this attitude, this compartmentalization, is probably one of the most dangerous and destructive attitudes that a human being can have. And it's nothing short of cutting off the connection between your own sense of self and emotional integrity with the larger macro sort of well-being and more comprehensive, I'm really struggling with the words here, sense of being in a society and the benefits of a more intimate and meaningful connection with other people and their sense of self and happiness and so forth. I don't know, it's a really, really complicated thing for me to describe, and I've tried several times, but it's difficult because it's so abstract, and yet at the same time it's very primal. Like, it's something that is very easy to feel, which is kind of why I felt like the word soul and the word soulless were such good metaphors, because it's like something that's hard-coded into you, but it's also something that kind of has a life of its own, and it's a little mystical in a way. But at any rate, I felt like there was something deeply, deeply wrong and disturbing about how people could be so happy and enjoy a sporting event so completely, while what happened in order for that sporting event to take place was so horrific and so awful and such a huge compromise, not just to the people who were directly involved, but to all of society and civilization. And it really is true that as long as one person is being abused and mistreated, we're all being abused and mistreated on some level. And there aren't many degrees of separation between that person in another country who's being worked to death in order to erect a stadium and the person who is watching the game being played in that stadium on their television And that's something that I think should always be on people's minds. And hopefully they will feel that in their souls, and they won't be able to just watch a soccer game and ignore the fact that there's blood all over those stands, blood all over the field. There's meaning there. There's something that just shouldn't be overlooked, because eventually all of that blood is gonna get spread around the world. So yeah, pretty dark stuff. I can't help it, but at the same time, I think it's the opposite of dark, because, as I was saying, it's the cultivation of that soul that creates the deeper, more intimate and meaningful connections between us and other people. Our capacity to develop compassion and empathy, to protect others, to shield them from harm, that is the most meaningful human attitude. It's the exact opposite of that blasé, callous lack of cognition of cause and effect between our happiness and what it takes to create that happiness. So yeah, kind of thought-provoking. I hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, thanks for watching.